facilitators. I hope you had a great first week in your GREAT28 group. We pick up here week 2 with Jesus asking a question. Who are my mother and brothers? In one sense, it's a real straightforward question. His mother and brothers are outside asking for him. But Jesus is going to redefine who is family to him. But Jesus asked the question at the end of Mark chapter 3, and to fully appreciate why he's asking this question at this time and what he hopes to accomplish with the question, we need to back up. And so just a warning on the front end, you're going to want to read ahead a little bit. Make sure you are familiar with Mark chapter 3. I've printed a good bit of it in your handout. Not every verse. I do skip some verses just to facilitate the reading of the passage and just being sensitive to your time, not being able to cover everything. But be sure you read ahead and you're familiar with where you're heading, where the study is trying to lead your group. So same layout. We open with a question that's intended for everyone to be able to answer as it relates to how their family responded to them as they indicated an interest to grow in their faith. Again, people can answer this very quickly and maybe on a fairly surface level. Others may want to go more deeply. But it's also a great time for those who maybe don't share as much to ask follow-up questions, just to show an interest and to draw them out and make sure you affirm them in their participation in the group and your desire to hear what they have to say. You'll find the Discover questions, because we're covering so much text, are pretty straightforward. You can move through these fairly quickly. I'll just comment on a couple of them here. The second one says, out of a larger group of disciples, Jesus chooses 12 to be with him. What did it mean for them to be with him? The text mentions a couple of specific things that were true of the apostles, but the general point you want to get here is being a disciple of Jesus meant more than simply passively hanging out with him just to hear what he had to say from time to time. It's true, the Greek word for disciple literally means learner. But learner in that culture had a much different meaning than it does in our culture. In our culture, if we think of a learner or a student, you often may think of students who are passively sitting at a desk while a teacher lectures them. But in that culture, learning and doing were closely tied. And you'll see that throughout the Gospels. Jesus will teach his disciples and then lead them into a practical application of what he has just taught. And so to be a disciple, to be a learner of Jesus, is far more than simply listening to him teach and taking good notes. It is active participation in the work that he is doing. And then skipping a question or two, you have a fairly controversial section in the passage about the unforgivable sin. And so the question is, why is saying Jesus is filled with an unclean spirit the unforgivable sin? And I would try not to spend too much time on this one, but just to cut to the chase, the unforgivable sin is unbelief. All sins can be forgiven by the one who has authority and power to forgive those sins. But if the one who has a power and authority to forgive sins, Jesus, if you assign him an unclean spirit and claim that what he does and what he says is prompted by an evil spirit, you have rejected the only one who has the power and authority to forgive your sins. You have left yourself in unbelief. So really, the only unforgivable sin is the sin of unbelief. And then the last question in this section contrasts Jesus' calling of the disciples with Jesus' family calling to him. You'll see as the story plays out, Jesus' family is very concerned about him, and they go and they're standing outside, calling him to come with them. But you just want to contrast that and show how Mark's contrasting that with the calling of the disciples. The disciples are inside. They are seated, listening to him. And they have been called by him to follow him. So we move into the next section, the deepen section, in which we begin to consider, now that we have a better understanding of what the text is saying, what does it mean? What's the significance of it? And so we don't spend a lot of time here, but just a couple of questions. What reason would the scribes have for discrediting Jesus? And you could cover a variety of things here, but probably what comes to most people's minds is simply the scribes had something to lose. They were considered the official interpreters of Jewish law. They knew the law better than anyone. And Jesus was turning on its head some of their interpretations. If Jesus was authoritative, it meant the scribes were wrong. Second question is related. Why might it be difficult for Jesus' family to see him as the one sent from God in the power of the Spirit? If you want additional material here, you could jump ahead to Mark 6, but really you see it within the text. Jesus' family knew him as a child. And the Jesus they're seeing as an adult is not the Jesus they grew up with. Jesus as an adult is attracting large crowds. He's offending spiritual leaders. He's casting out demons. This is not the Jesus they knew. And so those you would expect to be closest to Jesus, those you would expect to know him the best, his own family, are at this point in unbelief. The scribes who know the law best, the law that points to a Messiah, you would expect to join Jesus in what he is doing. And yet these scribes are in unbelief. So finally we move to the deliver section. We're trying to get a little more practical here. I think most of these questions are pretty straightforward. But I would just focus here sometimes, and the questions will lead you to talk about what people out there think and what hinders them from coming to Jesus. But as you work your way through those questions, we just encourage you to make sure at some point we begin to speak first person. Here's what I need to hear. Here's how I need to respond to the word that I have heard in our gathering here today. Okay? It's a fun study. It's a bit complicated. The passage, you have interweaving stories of Jesus and his family, Jesus and the religious leaders. But in the end, the point we're driving at here is that Jesus is redefining what it means to be family. Jesus is forming his church. He is gathering his disciples around his word. And as they come together to be with Jesus, to learn from him the kingdom life, Jesus says, these are the ones I call my brothers, my sisters. And so as Jesus asked the question, who are my mother or my brothers? He answers it. They're the ones who do the will of God. But it implies another question, and it's a question you want your group to grapple with. Am I? Am I in Jesus' family? So do a little work ahead of time. You will be grateful that you went it through, maybe thought through the questions and read the text before your group shows up. But know I'll be praying for you. If questions come up in your preparation, don't hesitate to contact me. I'd like to talk to you more with this. So, peace.